Welcome, dear listener, to this gentle exploration of how people in medieval times survived the long, cold winter months. As you settle into comfort, allow yourself to relax completely. There is nothing urgent here, nothing that requires your full attention. Simply let the words wash over you like soft waves on a distant shore. We will move slowly through the details of medieval winter life, examining each aspect with careful, unhurried attention. Let us begin at the very beginning with the slow, gradual arrival of winter in the medieval calendar. Winter did not arrive suddenly, you see. It came slowly, predictably, announced by the changing leaves and the shortening days. The medieval people marked the beginning of winter at Michaelmas, which fell on the 29th day of September. This was not an arbitrary date, but rather a carefully observed marker in the agricultural year. On Michaelmas, the harvest was ending. The fields, which had been golden with wheat and barley just weeks before, were now mostly bare. The stubble remained, short stalks sticking up from the earth like tiny pins. The air grew cooler each day, though not yet cold, not yet freezing, just cool, pleasantly cool at first, then less pleasant as the days went on. The geese began their migration. Villagers would look up at the sky and see the V-shaped formations flying south. The geese knew winter was coming. They always knew. Their honking calls echoed across the fields as they departed, leaving behind the humans who would have to endure what was coming. From Michaelmas until Candlemas on the 2nd of February, winter held its grip on the land. That is 4 months, 4 long months, 126 days, more or less. During this time, the earth would be too cold, too hard, too frozen to till. No planting could be done. No new crops could be started. Everything had to wait until the warmth returned, until Candlemas arrived and the land could be worked again. 4 months is a long time to survive when you cannot grow new food. A very long time indeed. Before winter arrived, there was much work to be done. So much work. The preparations began in late summer, really, as soon as people began to sense that autumn was approaching. The work never really stopped, but it changed in nature, became more focused, more urgent. The harvest had to be brought in, of course. Every last grain of wheat, every barley stalk, every oat. Nothing could be left in the fields. The villagers worked from dawn until dusk, bending over the crops, cutting with sickles, gathering the stalks into bundles, tying the bundles with twine made from straw. Their backs ached. Their hands developed caluses upon caluses. The work was hard, repetitive, endless, but it had to be done. It absolutely had to be done. Once the grain was cut, it had to be threshed. The bundles were brought to the threshing floor, where they were beaten with flails to separate the grain from the chaff. This too was repetitive work. Lift the flail, bring it down, lift it again, bring it down again, hour after hour, day after day. The rhythmic sound of the flails hitting the grain created a kind of music, though no one thought of it that way. It was just work, just the sound of survival. After threshing came winnowing, where the grain was tossed into the air, so the wind could blow away the lighter chaff, leaving only the heavier grain to fall back down. This required a gentle breeze, not too strong, not too weak, just right. If the wind was too strong, it might blow away some of the grain along with the chaff. If it was too weak, the chaff would not separate properly. Finding the right conditions for winnowing was important. The grain that was successfully harvested, threshed, and winnowed then had to be stored. Storage was crucial, absolutely crucial. If the grain got wet, it would rot. If mice got into it, they would eat it. If it was stored improperly, weevils and other insects would infest it, rendering it useless. so the grain was placed in large sacks made of thick cloth, or in wooden barrels, or in storage bins built specially for this purpose. These containers were kept in dry places, up off the ground, away from dampness and pests as much as possible. But grain was not the only thing that needed to be stored. There were vegetables too, root vegetables primarily. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions. These vegetables had the advantage of keeping well through the winter months if stored properly. They were harvested and placed in root cellars, cool, dark, underground spaces where the temperature remained relatively constant. The root cellar was typically dug beneath the house or nearby. It was lined with stones to keep the earth from collapsing inward. Wooden shelves might be installed along the walls, or the vegetables might simply be stored in bins or barrels. The important thing was that the cellar remained cool, but not freezing. If it got too warm, the vegetables would sprout or rot. If it got too cold, they would freeze and become inedible. The temperature had to be just right. Maintaining this temperature was not easy. It required constant attention throughout the winter. Someone had to check the cellar regularly, removing any vegetables that showed signs of rot before they contaminate the others. It was tedious work, but necessary work. Now, let us turn our attention to meat. Meat presented special challenges for winter storage. Unlike grain or root vegetables, meat would spoil quickly if not preserved properly, and spoiled meat was not merely unpleasant, it could make people sick, even kill them. So preserving meat was a matter of life and death. The primary method of meat preservation in medieval times was salting. Salt was precious, valuable, sometimes expensive, but absolutely necessary. Salt drew moisture out of the meat, creating an environment where the bacteria that caused spoilage could not thrive. Heavily salted meat could last for months. The process of salting meat began with the slaughter. In late autumn, usually around November, peasants would slaughter their pigs. Not all of the pigs, mind you. Some had to be kept alive to breed next year's pigs. But the pigs that had been fattened on acorns and other forage during the autumn months, those pigs were ready for slaughter. The slaughter was done carefully, deliberately. The pig would be killed quickly to minimize suffering, then hung up so that the blood could drain out. The blood was not wasted. No, nothing was wasted. The blood was collected in bowls and pans to be made into blood sausage or blood pudding. This was food too, and food was too valuable to waste. Once the blood was drained, the pig was butchered. Every part of the animal was used. The meat was cut into manageable pieces. The better cuts, the hams, the shoulders, the loins, these were carefully trimmed and prepared for salting. Each piece of meat was rubbed thoroughly with salt, coarse salt, lots of it. The salt was worked into every surface of the meat, ensuring complete coverage. Then the salted meat was packed into barrels or hung in a cool, dry place. Over time, the salt would draw out the moisture and the meat would cure. It would become harder, drier, less perishable. When someone wanted to eat this preserved meat during the winter, they would have to soak it in water first to remove some of the salt, or else it would be far too salty to eat. But even after soaking, the meat was still very salty. This was one of the defining characteristics of medieval winter cuisine. Everything was very salty, or very bland. There was not much middle ground. Fish, too, could be preserved through salting. In coastal areas or near rivers and lakes, fish were caught in abundance during the warmer months and then salted for winter storage. Herring, cod, and other fish were gutted, cleaned, and packed in salt. Like the salted meat, salted fish would last for months. Smoking was another method of preservation. Smoked meat and smoked fish were common in medieval diets. The smoking process involved hanging the meat or fish in a smokehouse, a small structure where wood was burned to create smoke. The smoke had a preservative effect, and it also added flavor. Smoked ham, smoked sausages, smoked fish, these were staples of the medieval winter diet. The smoking process was slow. It took days, sometimes weeks, for the meat to be properly smoked. The fire in the smokehouse had to be tended carefully. It could not be too hot, or it would cook the meat too quickly. It had to produce smoke steadily, continuously. This required attention, patience, and a good supply of wood. Wood for smoking was often green wood or wood from fruit trees, which produced a pleasant, smelling smoke. Apple wood, cherry wood, these were prized for smoking because they gave the meat a sweet, subtle flavor, but any wood would do if necessary. The important thing was to keep the smoke going. As winter settled in, the daily routine of medieval peasants changed considerably. There was less work to do in the fields, of course, since no crops could be ground, but that did not mean there was no work at all. There was always work, different work, but work nonetheless. The days were short, very short. In the depths of winter, the sun might rise at 8 o'clock in the morning and set by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That left only 8 hours of daylight, and not all of those hours were bright enough for detailed work. The morning was often dim and gray. The afternoon faded quickly into evening. People rose with the dawn, such as it was. They had no clocks, no way to tell time except by the position of the sun and the ringing of church bells. The church bells rang for prayers at specific times throughout the day, and these bells helped structure the daily routine. When the bells rang for morning prayers, people knew it was time to begin the day. Breakfast was simple. Usually it consisted of bread and ale. The bread was made from whatever grain was available, wheat for the wealthy, barley or oats for the poor. The bread was coarse, dark, heavy. It filled the stomach, which was its primary purpose. The ale was weak, watered down, but safer to drink than water, which was often contaminated. After breakfast, there was work to be done, though the nature of the work varied. Men might repair tools, mend fences, chop firewood. Women might spin wool, weave cloth, prepare meals. Children might help with these tasks or tend to any animals that remained alive through the winter. Firewood was a constant concern. The fire was the center of life in winter, providing both heat and light. Without it, people would freeze. So firewood had to be collected and stored in great quantities. Every stick, every log, every branch had value. Nothing was wasted. Collecting firewood was hard work. In the summer and autumn, men and boys would go into the forests with axes and saws to cut dead trees and fallen branches. They would haul this wood back to the village, where it would be stacked in large piles near each house. The wood had to be kept dry, so it was often covered with thatch or stored in a shed. As winter progressed, these wood piles slowly diminished. Each day, more wood was needed to keep the fire burning, and the fire had to be kept burning constantly. If it went out, it was difficult to relight it. There were no matches, no lighters. Fire was made by striking flint against steel to create sparks, which were caught on tinder, dry grass, moss, or charred cloth. These sparks would smolder, and by carefully blowing on them and adding more tinder, a flame could be coaxed into life. But this process took time and effort, so it was much better to simply keep the fire going. The hearth was the heart of the medieval home. It was where the fire burned, where meals were cooked, where people gathered for warmth. In a typical peasant house, the hearth was a simple affair, a flat stone area in the center of the room, or sometimes built into one wall. Above it, a hole in the roof allowed smoke to escape. This hole was not covered by glass or any other barrier. It was just an opening, allowing the smoke to drift upward and out. This arrangement had advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was that smoke could escape, preventing the house from filling with choking fumes. The disadvantage was that heat escaped too, along with the smoke, and cold air could drift down through the opening, creating drafts. So medieval homes were never really warm, even with a fire burning. They were warmer than the outside, certainly, but not warm in the way we think of warmth today. The fire itself was made of wood, primarily. Peat was also used in some regions, especially in Ireland and Scotland where peat was abundant. Peat was made from partially decomposed vegetation, cut from bogs and dried. It burned slowly, giving off a steady heat, though the smoke from peat had a distinctive, earthy smell. Keeping the fire fed required constant attention. During the day, someone had to periodically add wood to keep it burning. At night, the fire was banked, covered with ash, so that it would burn slowly, almost smoldering, but not go out completely. In the morning, the ash could be removed, fresh wood added, and the fire would spring back to life. Sometimes, despite all precautions, the fire did go out. When this happened, someone would have to go to a neighbor's house to borrow fire, literally carrying a piece of burning wood or a container with glowing coals from one house to another. This was one of the many ways that medieval communities depended on each other for survival. Around the hearth, the family would gather in the evening. There was not much else to do once darkness fell. Candles were expensive, so most peasants did not use them regularly. Rushlights, rushes dipped in tallow, provided some light, but not much. So people went to bed early, usually soon after the sun set. But before bed, there were a few hours around the fire. This was a time for conversation, for storytelling, for simple companionship. People might mend clothes by the firelight or work on small crafts. Children might play quiet games. The fire crackled and popped, sending up showers of sparks. Shadows danced on the walls. It was not an uncomfortable time, necessarily. The fire provided a focus center. People were together close, huddled around the warmth. There was a kind of security in this closeness, even if it was born of necessity rather than choice. Clothing was essential for survival in medieval winters. Without proper clothing, the cold could kill. So people dressed in layers, wearing as much as they could to trap heat close to their bodies. The base layer was linen. Linen was made from flax, which was grown in fields and processed through a long, labor-intensive procedure. The flax plants were pulled from the ground, then soaked in water to rot away the outer fibers, a process called retting. After retting, the flax was dried, then beaten to break up the woody core. The remaining fibers were combed and spun into thread, which was then woven into cloth. Linen cloth was relatively smooth and comfortable against the skin. It was not as warm as wool, but it served an important purpose. Linen undergarments, a tunic or shift worn next to the skin, absorbed the sweat and provided a barrier between the skin and the outer woolen garments. Wool was the primary fabric for outer garments. Wool came from sheep, of course. Sheep were sheared in the spring when they no longer needed their heavy winter coats. The wool was washed to remove dirt and lanolin, then combed or carded to align the fibers. After combing, the wool was spun into yarn using a spindle or, in later medieval times, a spinning wheel. Spinning wool was time-consuming work. It took many hours to produce enough yarn for even a simple garment. Women spent countless hours spinning, their hands moving in practiced, repetitive motions. Spin the spindle, twist the fibers, wind the yarn. Spin, twist, wind, over and over and over. Once the wool was spun into yarn, it could be woven into cloth. Weaving was done on looms, large wooden frames with threads stretched between them. The weaver would pass the shuttle back and forth through these threads, gradually building up the fabric row by row. Weaving, like spinning, was slow work, but the result was worth it. Thick, warm woolen cloth. This cloth was then cut and sewn into garments. A typical medieval peasant might wear woolen hose on their legs, a woolen tunic over their linen undergarment, and a woolen cloak over everything. The cloak was particularly important. It was a large, heavy piece of fabric that could be wrapped around the body for warmth. It could also be used as a blanket at night. Wool had many advantages as a winter fabric. It was warm even when wet. It was durable, lasting for years with proper care, and it was widely available since sheep are common throughout Europe. But wool also had disadvantages. It was itchy, irritating the skin if worn directly. It was heavy, especially when wet, and it required maintenance. Woolen garments had to be aired out regularly to prevent them from developing an unpleasant smell. In addition to tunics and cloaks, people wore hats and hoods. Covering the head was important, as much body heat escapes through the head. A simple woolen hood could make a significant difference in how cold someone felt. Peasants wore hoods that covered their head and shoulders, tying under the chin to stay in place even in windy conditions. Mittens were worn on the hands, not gloves with individual fingers, but mittens, coverings for the whole hand with a separate section for the thumb. Mittens were warmer than gloves because they allowed the fingers to share heat. They were made of wool or leather, sometimes lined with fur. Speaking of fur, wealthier people lined their winter garments with fur for extra warmth, but peasants generally could not afford expensive furs like ermine or mink. They might, however, use rabbit fur or lambskin, which were more accessible. A peasant might trap rabbits for food and use the pelts to line a cloak or make mittens. Every part of the rabbit was used: the meat for eating, the bones for tools or soup, the fur for warmth. Footwear was also important. Peasants typically wore simple leather shoes or boots. These were not waterproof, so walking through snow or mud would leave feet wet and cold. To combat this, people stuffed their shoes with straw or dried grass for insulation. The straw would absorb some of the moisture and provide a small amount of cushioning and warmth. At night, people did not have the pajamas we use today. They slept in their undergarments, the linen shift or tunic, and often wore a nightcap to keep their head warm. Medieval people believed that cold night air was dangerous, that it could cause illness, so covering the head while sleeping was considered important. Let us now turn our attention to the medieval home itself and how it functioned during the winter months. Most peasants lived in simple houses, far removed from the grand castles and manor houses of the nobility. A typical peasant house was small, often just 1 or 2 rooms. The walls were made of timber frames filled with wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes dung. This material was not particularly good at insulating against the cold, but it was cheap and readily available. The roof was thatched with straw or reeds. Thatch was actually quite effective at keeping out rain and providing some insulation, but it required maintenance. Every few years, the thatch needed to be repaired or replaced as it deteriorated. The floor was typically packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. Wooden floors were a luxury that most peasants could not afford. The earthen floor was cold, especially in winter, so the layer of rushes provided some insulation and made it slightly more comfortable to walk on. Windows, if there were any, were small and few. Glass was expensive, far beyond the means of ordinary peasants, so windows were simply openings in the wall, sometimes covered with wooden shutters that could be closed to keep out wind and rain. But closing the shutters also blocked out light, leaving the interior of the house dark and gloomy. In winter, there was a constant trade off between light and warmth. Open the shutters and let in light, but also let in cold drafts. Close the shutters and keep out the cold, but sit in darkness. Most people compromised, keeping shutters partially open during the day and closing them fully at night. The single room of a peasant house served multiple purposes. It was kitchen, living room, and bedroom all in one. The hearth was in the center or along one wall, providing heat and a place to cook. Benches or simple wooden stools provided seating. At night, people slept on simple mattresses made of straw, filled sacks laid out on the floor or on low wooden platforms. Privacy was not really a concept in medieval peasant life. Families lived together in close quarters, with little or no separation between activities or individuals. Children slept in the same room as their parents, often in the same bed. Multiple family members might share a single large bed for warmth. These beds were not like modern beds. There was no box spring, no comfortable mattress, just a wooden frame, perhaps with ropes stretched across it to provide some support, and a mattress made of a large sack stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers if one was wealthy. Sheets and blankets were made of linen or wool, heavy and somewhat coarse by modern standards. To make the bed warmer on cold winter nights, people employed various strategies. One common method was to heat stones or bricks in the fire, then wrap them in cloth and place them in the bed before sleeping. These heated stones would gradually release their warmth, keeping the bed more comfortable for a few hours. Another strategy was simply to pile on more blankets and covers. People might sleep under 2, 3, or even more layers of blankets, cloaks, and furs. Body heat, trapped by all these layers, would keep the sleeper reasonably warm. Despite these measures, medieval homes were never truly comfortable in winter. They were cold, drafty, often smoky from the fire. The smell inside was probably quite strong, a mixture of wood smoke, cooking odors, unwashed bodies, and animals, since some peasants kept their livestock in the house during winter to provide additional warmth. Yes, animals in the house. This was not uncommon, especially in the coldest regions. A cow, a few sheep, some chickens. These animals generated body heat, and in a small enclosed space, this heat made a noticeable difference. The animals were kept at one end of the house, separated from the human living space by a simple partition, but their presence was certainly felt. The medieval winter diet was monotonous, limited, and often inadequate. Without refrigeration or advanced preservation techniques, people had to rely on foods that could be stored for months without spoiling. Bread was the staple of every meal. Bread, and more bread. It was eaten at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The type of bread varied depending on one's wealth. White bread, made from refined wheat flour, was for the rich. Peasants ate dark bread made from barley, rye, or oats. This dark bread was coarse, dense, and filling, though not particularly pleasant to eat. Baking bread was done in communal ovens in many villages. A peasant family would prepare their dough at home, then take it to the village oven to be baked. The baker would charge a small fee for the use of the oven. This system was efficient, as it required less fuel than having each family maintain their own oven, but it also meant that bread baking was not done daily. Instead, families would bake a week's worth of bread at once, then eat it gradually as it became harder and staler. All was the primary beverage. Everyone drank, all men, women, children. Water was often contaminated and unsafe to drink, so ale, even weak ale, was preferred. The ale consumed by peasants was not like modern beer. It was thick, somewhat sour, low in alcohol, and nutritious. It provided calories and vitamins, supplementing the diet. Pottage was the most common cooked dish during winter. Pottage was a thick stew or porridge made by boiling whatever ingredients were available in a large pot over the fire. The base was usually grains, oats, barley, or peas cooked in water or broth until they became soft and mushy. To this base, various additions might be made of onions, leeks, turnips, parsnips, cabbage, herbs. The pottage pot sat over the fire, simmering slowly for hours. More ingredients could be added as the day went on. Bits of salted meat or fish might go in if available, though meat was scarce in winter and used sparingly. More often, pottage was a vegetarian dish, flavored with herbs like parsley, sage, or thyme. Pottage was not particularly exciting, but it was nourishing and filling. It could be eaten with a spoon or soaked up with bread. The same pot of pottage might be eaten at multiple meals, with fresh ingredients added to keep it going for days. Cheese was another important winter food. Cheese was made during the summer and autumn, when cows and goats were producing milk. The milk was curdled, the curds separated from the whey, and the curds pressed and aged to make cheese. Hard cheeses could last for months, providing a source of protein and fat during the winter. Eggs were less common in winter, as chickens laid fewer eggs when days were short and cold. But some eggs were available, and they were valued for their nutritional content. Preserved meats, salted pork, salted fish, smoked ham were eaten sparingly, as they had to last the entire winter. A family might have a side of bacon hanging in the house, and they would cut thin slices from it as needed, making it last as long as possible. Fruits and vegetables were scarce in winter. Apples, if stored properly in a cool cellar, might last until midwinter. Dried fruits, apples, pears, plums could be kept longer. Root vegetables from the cellar provided some variety, but fresh produce was essentially non-existent. This limited diet meant that many people suffered from nutritional deficiencies during winter. Vitamin C deficiency could lead to scurvy, a disease that causes bleeding gums, loose teeth, and fatigue. Lack of vitamin D, combined with limited sunlight, could cause rickets in children. These diseases were common in medieval times, though people did not understand their causes. Hunger was a constant companion for many peasants. The stored food had to be rationed carefully to make it last until spring. If the harvest had been poor, or if too much grain was taken by the Lord as taxes, families might face genuine starvation. Even in good years, by late winter people were often eating less than they needed, growing thin and weak as they waited for spring. Meals in medieval winter followed a simple pattern, dictated by the hours of daylight and the demands of daily work. Breakfast was eaten at dawn or soon after. As mentioned, it typically consisted of bread and ale, perhaps with some cheese or leftover pottage from the night before. This meal was quick and simple, not much ceremony attached to it. People ate standing up or sitting on benches, using their fingers or simple wooden bowls and spoons. Forks were not used in medieval times, at least not by common people. The main meal of the day was dinner, eaten around midday when the sun was highest. Dinner was more substantial than breakfast, though still modest by modern standards. It might include bread, ale, pottage, and perhaps a small portion of cheese or salted fish. If there was any meat, it would likely be served at dinner rather than other meals. Preparing dinner required work throughout the morning. The pottage pot had to be tended, the fire kept going, bread had to be sliced, all brought up from storage. Women did most of this work, though children helped. The family ate together, gathered around the fire or at a simple wooden table if they had one. Conversation was minimal. People were focused on eating, on filling their bellies. The meal might last half an hour, perhaps a bit more. After dinner, work continued. There were still chores to be done, animals to tend, maintenance tasks to complete. The afternoon was shorter than the morning, as the sun set early, so every hour of daylight had to be used productively. Supper was the final meal of the day, eaten in the evening before bed. It was lighter than dinner, often just bread and all, maybe some cheese or a bowl of pottage. By this time, people were tired from the day's work, ready to rest. They ate quickly, then settled in around the fire for a short time before sleeping. Eating supper by firelight in the dim, smoky interior of the house was a quiet affair. The day was ending. Outside, darkness had fallen. Inside, the flickering flames cast shifting shadows. People were hungry, but they had eaten what they could. Now it was time to sleep, to conserve energy, to wait for morning. Nighttime in a medieval home was very different from nighttime in a modern home. There was no electric light, no television, no entertainment of any kind. When the sunset, darkness fell, and there was little to do but sleep. People went to bed early, often within an hour or two of sunset. There was no reason to stay awake in the dark, burning precious rushlight or candles. Better to sleep, to rest, to conserve body heat and energy. Before sleeping, there were a few preparations. The fire had to be banked for the night, covered with ash so it would burn slowly. Wooden shutters had to be closed and secured. Any loose items had to be put away. Then the family would retire to their sleeping places. As mentioned earlier, people slept on simple straw mattresses, often sharing beds with family members. Children might sleep together in one bed, parents in another, or the entire family might sleep in one large bed. This sleeping arrangement provided warmth through shared body heat, which was important in the cold winter night. Before getting into bed, people might place heated stones wrapped in cloth at the foot of the bed. These stones, warmed in the fire, would keep the bed from being ice cold when they first lay down. People slept in their linen undergarments and nightcaps. The nightcap was important. Medieval people believed that sleeping with an uncovered head would make one sick. So everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest adult, wore a cap to bed. Once in bed, people pulled the blankets up over themselves. Woolen blankets, heavy and somewhat scratchy, but warm. Sometimes cloaks would be used as additional covers. In the very coldest weather, people might pile on every available blanket, cloak, and fur, creating a heavy, warm cocoon. Sleep was not continuous through the night in medieval times. Many people practiced what historians call segmented sleep or biphasic sleep. They would sleep for a few hours, then wake in the middle of the night for an hour or two, then sleep again until morning. During this wakeful period, in the middle of the night, people might pray, tend to the fire, use the chamber pot, or engage in quiet conversation with their bed partner. Then they would return to sleep for the second segment of the night. This pattern of sleep was considered normal in medieval times. It was not insomnia or a sleep disorder. It was simply the way people slept before artificial lighting changed human sleep patterns. The night was long in winter, very long, with sunset coming at 4 or 5 o'clock and sunrise not until 8 o'clock or later. There could be 15 or 16 hours of darkness. Even sleeping in 2 segments, there was a lot of time spent in bed, waiting for morning. The darkness was total, absolute, without even a nightlight or street lamp. A medieval house at night was pitch black. If someone needed to move around, to tend to a crying child, to use the chamber pot, to check on the fire, they had to do so by feel, carefully navigating the familiar but invisible space. Outside, the winter night was even more profound. The stars might be visible on clear nights, providing some faint illumination, but on cloudy nights, nothing could be seen at all. The world was reduced to sound and touch, the wind howling around the house, the cold pressing in, the sounds of animals or other people muffled by walls and distance. It was a different experience of night than we have today, more isolating, more intense. Night was a time to be endured, to be survived, not a time for activity or entertainment. Despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, community life continued through the winter months. People needed each other, depended on each other, and found ways to maintain social connections even when travel was difficult and daylight was scarce. The church remained a center of community life. People attended Mass on Sundays and holy days, gathering in the village church to pray and hear the priest speak. The church was cold, even colder than their homes, being made of stone with high ceilings, but people bundled up and endured it. Some brought braziers or hand warmers filled with hot coals to help ward off the chill. Church attendance was not optional. It was expected, required even. The church calendar structured the year, and religious festivals provided breaks from the monotony of winter life. Christmas, of course, was the major festival, falling in the darkest part of winter and bringing celebrations that contrasted with the general grimness of the season. Christmas celebrations in medieval times were simpler than modern celebrations, but no less significant. There would be a special Mass, feasting if food was available, and time spent with family and friends. For the wealthy, Christmas might mean elaborate feasts with multiple courses. For peasants, it meant a slightly better meal than usual, perhaps with some meat or special bread. After Christmas came Epiphany on January 6th, then Candlemas on February 2nd. These religious festivals broke up the winter into manageable segments, giving people something to look forward to. Between festivals, social interaction happened in smaller ways. Neighbors might visit each other in the evenings, gathering around someone's fire to share stories and conversation. This was especially common when there was work to be done that could benefit from multiple hands: spinning wool, mending tools, preparing food. Women in particular maintained social networks through these gatherings. While men's work was often solitary in winter, women would come together to spin wool or weave cloth, working side by side while talking. This social interaction was important for mental health, providing relief from the isolation that winter could bring. Children played when they could, though winter limited outdoor play. Snow, when it fell, provided opportunities for snowball fights and sledding. On frozen ponds or rivers, children and adults alike might enjoy ice skating, using skates made from animal bones strapped to their shoes. But these activities were weather dependent. On very cold or stormy days, children stayed indoors, playing simple games with pebbles or sticks, or simply sitting by the fire listening to adults talk. Storytelling was an important form of entertainment through the long winter evenings. Tales of heroes and saints, stories passed down through generations, news and gossip from other villages All of these provided distraction from the cold and dark. Someone with a talent for storytelling was valued in the community, their skills bringing light to dark evenings in a metaphorical sense. Winter brought significant health challenges to medieval people. The cold, the poor nutrition, the crowded living conditions, all of these contributed to illness and death. Respiratory illnesses were common. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lung infections thrived in the cold, damp conditions of medieval homes. The smoke from the fire irritated lungs and weakened the respiratory system. Poor nutrition meant weakened immune systems that could not fight off infections effectively. People coughed through the winter months. Deep, rattling coughs that shook their bodies. Some recovered, some did not. Children and elderly people were particularly vulnerable, their deaths accepted as a natural part of winter. Hypothermia was a constant threat, especially for the elderly, the very young, and the poor. If the fire went out, if there was not enough fuel, if clothing was inadequate, body temperature could drop dangerously low. Confusion, sluggishness, and eventually unconsciousness would follow if the person could not get warm. Frostbite affected those who had to work outside in the coldest weather. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were particularly vulnerable. Frostbitten tissue would turn white, then black, and might eventually fall off. Severe cases could lead to infection and death. Diseases spread easily in the close quarters of winter living. If one family member fell ill, others would likely follow. Influenza, though not understood as such at the time, swept through communities regularly, killing the weak and vulnerable. Malnutrition was perhaps the greatest health challenge. By late winter, food stores were running low. People were eating less, their bodies slowly weakening from lack of proper nutrition. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, caused bleeding gums and loosening teeth. Rickets, from lack of vitamin D and insufficient sunlight, caused bone deformities in children. Medieval medicine could do little for these conditions. Physicians, where they existed at all, relied on theories of humors and balances that had little connection to actual disease processes. Treatments might involve bloodletting, herbal remedies, or prayer. Some herbal remedies had real medicinal value, but many did not. Most peasants never saw a physician. They relied instead on folk remedies passed down through generations. Willow bark tea for pain and fever, honey for wounds, garlic for illness. These remedies sometimes helped, sometimes did not. Mostly, people endured illness and hoped for recovery. Death in winter was common. Infant mortality was high year-round, but winter made it worse. Elderly people who survived summer often did not survive winter. The weak, the sick, the very poor, they died, and their deaths were mourned but expected. Bodies of those who died in winter often could not be buried immediately. The ground was frozen, too hard to dig, so bodies were stored in outbuildings or church crypts until spring, when the earth thawed and burial became possible. Medieval people paid close attention to weather patterns and natural signs. Without modern forecasting, they relied on accumulated wisdom and careful observation to predict what winter would bring. Animals provided clues. If squirrels gather unusually large stores of nuts, it meant a harsh winter was coming. If birds migrated earlier than usual, winter would arrive soon. If animals grew thicker than normal, cold temperatures were expected. The sky offered signs as well. Certain cloud formations, the color of the sunset, the clarity of the stars, all of these could indicate coming weather. A red sky at night meant good weather the next day. A red sky in the morning meant storms were coming. Plants provided information too. If tree bark was thicker than usual, if acorns were abundant, if certain plants bloomed or went dormant at unusual times. These were all signals that experienced observers could interpret. The timing of the first frost was particularly important. An early frost meant an early, long winter. A late frost meant a shorter winter season. People watched anxiously for this first frost, as it determined when they needed to bring in the last of the harvest and make final preparations. Once winter settled in, daily weather observations continued. People needed to know if a storm was coming, if temperatures were dropping dangerously low, if snow was expected. Their survival could depend on these predictions. Watching the smoke from the fire provided clues. If smoke rose straight up, the weather would be fair. If smoke hung low and drifted, precipitation was coming. If smoke swirled and eddied, storms were approaching. The behavior of livestock also indicated weather changes. Cattle would huddle together before a storm. Chickens would return to roost early if bad weather was coming. Dogs would become restless and anxious. These observations were not superstition. They were practical knowledge gained through generations of experience. While not always accurate, they were often reliable enough to be useful. As winter dragged on, people waited for signs of spring. From Michaelmas to Candlemas was 4 months, but the actual cold weather often lasted longer. Even after Candlemas, when the land could theoretically be worked again, there were often weeks more of cold weather to endure. By late winter, food stores were running low. The preserved meats were mostly gone. The root cellar was nearly empty. The grain bins were less than half full. People began to ration more carefully, eating less, making everything stretch as far as possible. Hunger became a constant companion. Stomachs growled. Thoughts turned obsessively to food. People dreamed of feasts, of fresh bread, of meat and cheese and all. But there was nothing to do but endure and wait. Children suffered particularly from the late winter hunger. They were growing, needing more food but receiving less. Their faces became thin, their bellies swollen. Some did not survive to see spring, but there were signs, small signs, that spring was approaching. Days grew imperceptibly longer. The sun rose slightly earlier each morning, set slightly later each evening. The change was so gradual as to be almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Birds began to return. First a few, then more and more. Their songs, absent through the winter months, began to fill the air again. This was a hopeful sound, a promise of warmth to come. Snow, if there had been snow, began to melt. Water dripped from roofs. Ice on ponds grew thin and began to crack. Mud appeared where there had been frozen ground, and then, finally, the first signs of green. Tiny shoots pushing up through the soil, buds appearing on tree branches. The world, which had been brown and white and gray for so long, slowly began to show color again. These signs brought hope, relief, joy. People had survived another winter. The hard months were ending. Soon there would be fresh food again. Soon the weather would be warm. Soon life would be easier. But that time was not yet. Even as the signs of spring appeared, winter still held on. Cold snaps still came. Late snowfalls still happened. The transition from winter to spring was gradual, uncertain, tentative. People waited. They watched. They hoped. They rationed their remaining food carefully. They kept their fires burning. They endured as they had endured all winter long. Each day in winter followed a similar pattern. The sameness was both comforting and oppressive. There was security and routine, but also monotony. Morning began the same way every day. Someone would get up, usually while it was still dark, and tend to the fire. The banked coals would be uncovered, fresh wood added, the fire coaxed back to life. As the fire grew, it would provide light and warmth, making it possible for others to rise. Rising from bed in a cold room was unpleasant. The warmth of the blankets had to be left behind, replaced by the cold air of the room. People dressed quickly, pulling on layers of clothing while still half asleep. Breakfast was eaten simple and quick. Then the day's work began. The specific tasks varied from day to day, but the overall pattern remained consistent. Men worked at maintaining tools, cutting firewood, tending animals. Women worked at spinning, weaving, cooking, maintaining the household. Children helped with whatever tasks they were capable of performing. Work was punctuated by meals. Midday dinner provided a break, a chance to warm up by the fire and eat something hot. Then work resumed through the afternoon. As evening approached and light faded, work slowed and stopped. Supper was eaten. The family gathered by the fire. Conversation happened, though it was often minimal. People were tired. They had little news to share, having been in the same small space all day, doing the same tasks as yesterday and the day before. Then to bed early as darkness fell. The same routine day after day after day, week after week, month after month. This repetitive rhythm had a dulling effect on the mind. Time seemed to pass both quickly and slowly. Days blurred together, indistinguishable from each other. Yet the winter as a whole seemed endless, stretching forward without clear end. But this rhythm also provided structure. People knew what to expect. They knew what needed to be done. There was a kind of comfort in this predictability, even if it was also boring. Managing fuel through the winter was a crucial task that required constant attention and careful planning. Firewood, as mentioned, was the primary fuel, though peat was used in some regions. The amount of firewood needed for a winter was substantial. A family might need several cords of wood, a cord being a stack of wood measuring 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. This was a lot of wood, representing many days of labor to cut, transport, and stack. Calculating how much wood would be needed was an art. Too little, and the family might run out before winter ended, facing the prospect of a cold house with no way to cook. Too much was better than too little, but it meant extra labor that could have been used for other purposes. Throughout the winter, the wood supply had to be monitored. Someone had to keep track of how much remained, how quickly it was being used, whether the consumption rate would allow the supply to last until spring. Using wood efficiently was important. Burning too much at once wasted fuel. Letting the fire burn too low meant having to use more fuel to bring it back up to temperature. Finding the right balance, keeping the fire burning steadily but not wastefully, required skill and attention. Different types of wood burned differently. Hardwoods like oak burned slowly and provided long-lasting heat. Softwoods like pine burned quickly and provided intense but short-lived heat. Knowing which wood to use when was part of household management expertise. Wood had to be kept dry. Wet wood did not burn well, producing more smoke than heat, so the wood pile had to be protected from rain and snow, covered with thatch or stored under a roof. As the wood pile diminished, anxiety increased. Would there be enough? What if winter lasted longer than expected? What if an unexpected cold snap required more fuel than planned? These worries were not unfounded. Some winters were longer than others. Some were colder, and running out of fuel was a genuine crisis. Without fire, people could not cook, could not stay warm, could not survive. If a family did run out of firewood, they might try to borrow from neighbors. But if the entire village was running low, this was not an option. People might resort to burning furniture, or parts of their house, or going into the forest in the depths of winter to try to find fallen branches under the snow. Fortunately, most families did not run out of fuel. They planned carefully, rationed wisely, and made their stores last through winter. But the worry was always there, a background anxiety that colored the entire season. Winter had its own soundscape, different from other seasons. Some sounds were more prominent in winter, others were absent. The most constant sound was the wind. Winter wind howled and moaned, rattling shutters, whistling through cracks in walls, bending tree branches. On stormy days, the wind was loud, almost overwhelming. On calm days, it was a softer background presence, always there, always reminding you of the cold outside. The crackling of the fire was another constant sound. The pop and hiss of burning wood, the occasional louder crack as a log split from heat, the soft rustling of flames. This sound was comforting, associated with warmth and safety. Inside the house, there were human sounds. Conversation, when it happened. The sounds of work, the rhythmic scrape of a knife being sharpened, the soft whoosh of a spindle turning, the tap of a hammer, the sounds of eating spoons scraping bowls, teeth crunching bread, the swallowing of ale. At night, there were different sounds. Snoring, the rustle of blankets as someone shifted position, the breathing of sleeping family members. Occasionally, a cry from a child having a nightmare or needing comfort. But there was also silence, deep silence. In winter, many of the sounds of the countryside were absent. Birds were fewer and quieter. Insects were gone entirely. The sounds of agricultural work, scything, threshing, voices calling across fields, these were absent. This silence could be eerie, oppressive even. The world seemed emptier in winter, less alive. The silence pressed in, making small sounds seem louder in contrast. Snow, when it fell, had its own effect on sound. Fresh snow dampened noise, absorbing sound waves and making everything quieter. Walking through snow made a particular crunching sound, different from the sound of footsteps on bare ground. Ice had sounds too, the crack of ice forming on a pond, the tinkle of icicles, the crunch of frozen ground underfoot. Church bells, when they rang, seemed to carry farther in cold winter air. Their sound marked the hours, called people to prayer, announced births and deaths. The bells were a connection to the wider world, to the community, to the structure of time and faith. At night, the silence was most profound. No traffic sounds, no mechanical hums, none of the background noise of modern life, just silence, occasionally broken by the wind or an animal sound. This silence was something modern people rarely experience, a true, deep quiet that could feel either peaceful or unsettling depending on one's mood, despite the hardships, or perhaps to provide relief from them. Winter was marked by festivals and celebrations. These broke up the monotony and gave people something to look forward to. Christmas, as mentioned, was the major winter festival. Preparations began in Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas. This was supposed to be a time of fasting and spiritual preparation, but the fasting was often limited in practice, as people were already eating sparingly due to winter food shortages. On Christmas Day, people attended church for a special Mass. The church might be decorated with evergreen branches, which remained green through the winter and symbolized eternal life. Candles would be lit, more candles than usual, creating a warm glow in the cold stone building. After church, there would be feasting, such as it was. For wealthy households, Christmas meant elaborate meals with multiple meat dishes, pies, and ale or wine. For peasants, Christmas dinner might be a slightly better version of their usual fare, perhaps some preserved meat added to the pottage, or a special loaf of wheat bread instead of the usual barley bread. The 12 days of Christmas, from December 25 to January 6, were a festive period. Work was minimized. People visited neighbors, shared food if they had extra, told stories, and generally tried to make the best of the dark season. Epiphany on January 6 marked the end of the Christmas season. This was another holy day with special church services. Between Epiphany and Candlemas on February 2, there were few festivals. These were often the coldest, darkest weeks of winter, with little to celebrate. People simply endured, counting the days until Candlemas. Candlemas had both religious and practical significance. Religiously, it celebrated the presentation of Jesus at the temple. Practically, it marked the point at which winter was considered to be ending and spring beginning. After Candlemas, though it might still be cold, the days were noticeably longer and the land could begin to be worked again. At Candlemas, candles were blessed in church. These blessed candles were taken home and kept for use through the year, believed to have protective properties. Besides these major festivals, there were minor celebrations and observances throughout winter, saint days, local customs, small rituals that varied from place to place. These provided small breaks in the routine, moments of community and connection. Even in the depths of winter, people found ways to celebrate, to connect, to make life bearable. The human spirit, even under harsh conditions, sought light and warmth and joy. For medieval people, faith was not separate from daily life. It was woven into every aspect of existence. In winter, when survival was most precarious, faith took on special significance. Prayer was a constant practice. People prayed throughout the day, upon rising, before meals, before sleeping. They prayed for protection from the cold, for sufficient food, for health, for the safety of family members. They prayed to God, to Jesus, to Mary, to the saints. The church's calendar structured time and provided meaning to the passage of days. Each saint's day, each holy day, marked a point in the winter's progress. These observances broke up time into manageable pieces. When someone fell ill, prayers were offered for their recovery. When someone died, prayers were offered for their soul. When winter seemed endless, prayers were offered for the coming of spring. Faith provided comfort and hope. Medieval people believed that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. They believed that God had a plan, that hardship had meaning, that enduring patiently was virtuous. This belief system helped people cope with conditions that might otherwise have seemed unbearable. When a child died, grief was real and deep, but it was tempered by the belief that the child was now in heaven, free from earthly suffering. When hunger gnawed at the belly, it could be offered up as a form of fasting, a spiritual practice. The church building itself was a refuge. It was cold, true, but it was also a place of community, a place where people gathered and remembered that they were part of something larger than their individual struggles. Priests provided spiritual guidance and also practical assistance in some cases. The church sometimes had stores of food that could be distributed to the needy. Monasteries and convents provided charity, though the amount varied greatly depending on their resources. Religious objects provided comfort. A simple wooden cross hung on the wall, a small statue or image of a saint, rosary beads worn around the neck. These objects served as reminders of faith, touchstones in difficult times. For medieval people, faith was not optional. It was as necessary as food, as essential as shelter. It provided a framework for understanding suffering, a reason to continue, a hope for better things to come. Women's work in winter, while different from men's work, was no less essential. Women were responsible for the domestic sphere, and in winter, the challenges of maintaining a household multiplied. Cooking was a constant task. The fire had to be tended, the pottage stirred, bread prepared. These tasks required continuous attention throughout the day. The pot of pottage, sitting over the fire, needed to be watched to ensure it did not burn or boil over. Ingredients had to be added at appropriate times. The fire needed just the right amount of wood to maintain steady heat. Baking bread was done less frequently in winter than in summer, but it still had to be done. The dough had to be kneaded, shaped, left to rise, then baked. This process took hours and required physical strength. Kneading dough was hard work. Water had to be fetched. This task often fell to women or children. In summer, it might not be too onerous, but in winter it was challenging. If the well or stream was frozen, ice had to be broken. Carrying heavy buckets of water back to the house in cold weather was difficult. Spinning wool was another major task for women. Wool had been carded in the autumn, and through the winter months it had to be spun into yarn. This was time-consuming work that filled many hours. Women would sit by the fire, spindle in hand, slowly transforming fluffy wool into usable thread. The motion of spinning was repetitive, rhythmic. Drop the spindle, let it spin, pull out the wool fibers, twist them, wind the yarn. Drop, spin, pull, twist, wind. Hour after hour, it was work that could be done while talking or thinking, work that kept hands busy while the mind wandered. Weaving turned spun yarn into cloth. This was done on a loom, a large wooden frame that took up considerable space. The weaver would pass a shuttle back and forth through the warp threads, gradually building up the fabric. Like spinning, weaving was repetitive and time-consuming. Women also did mending. Clothes wore out through constant use and needed repair. Holes had to be patched, seams resewn, tears mended. In a time when cloth was valuable and new clothes rare, keeping existing garments in good repair was important. Childcare was another responsibility. Children needed to be fed, dressed, supervised, taught. In the close quarters of winter, when everyone was inside most of the time, managing children's needs and preventing conflicts required patience and skill. Women also managed the household stores. They decided how much food to use each day, rationing carefully to make supplies last. This required planning and calculation. Too much food used early in winter meant shortages later. Too little meant hungry family members now. In some households, women also cared for animals kept inside during winter. Chickens, if there were any, needed feeding. A cow or goat needed milking, feeding, and cleaning up after. These tasks added to the daily workload. Women's work was never done. From the moment of rising until the moment of sleeping, there were tasks requiring attention, and much of this work was invisible. It produced no tangible product, just the maintenance of life. Yet without this work, the family could not survive. For children, winter was a time of both hardship and, in some ways, opportunity. The hardships were real: cold, hunger, illness, boredom. But winter also brought changes to their daily routine that were not all negative. Young children, too small to be much help with work, spent most of their time inside near the fire. They played simple games, making toys from sticks and stones, playing with scraps of cloth, creating imaginary worlds with whatever materials were at hand. Older children were expected to work. Boys might help their fathers with tasks like splitting firewood or tending animals. Girls might help their mothers with spinning, cooking, or childcare. But even with work responsibilities, winter meant somewhat less labor than summer, when agricultural work was constant and demanding. School, such as it existed, might continue through winter for some children. In towns, there might be schools attached to churches where children could learn to read and write, but for most peasant children, formal education was not available. what education they received came from their parents, learning by watching and doing. Children learn skills through observation and practice. A girl would learn to spin by watching her mother, then trying it herself with her mother's guidance. A boy would learn to use tools by watching his father and being gradually allowed to help. Winter illness affected children particularly hard. Their smaller bodies were less able to fight off infection. Respiratory illnesses, so common in the cold, damp conditions of medieval homes, could quickly become serious for a child. Parents watched anxiously when their children fell ill, knowing that recovery was far from guaranteed. But children also had remarkable resilience. They adapted to conditions that seem harsh to modern sensibilities. They played in the cold, made entertainment from nothing, found joy in small things. Snow, when it fell, was a delight for children. They made snowballs, built snow structures, played games in the white landscape. These snow days provided breaks from the monotony of winter, chances to run and shout and play. For children, winter was simply the way things were. They had never known central heating or abundant food or electric lights. The hardships of winter were not unusual or surprising. They were just life. And within those constraints, children found ways to be children. For families that owned animals, caring for livestock through winter presented special challenges. Animals needed food, water, and shelter just as humans did, and providing these things required effort and resources. Cattle, if a family owned any, were valuable assets. A cow provided milk, which could be made into cheese and butter. Cows also produced calves, which could be raised and sold or butchered for meat. Keeping a cow alive through winter was worth considerable effort. Cows need a lot of food. In summer, they could graze in pastures or on common land. In winter, they had to be fed stored hay. The hay had been cut in summer, dried, and stored in stacks or in a barn. Each day, the cow needed a portion of this hay. Water for cattle was another concern. Cows drink a lot of water, and in winter, water sources might freeze. Someone had to break the ice daily or provide water some other way. Sheep, kept primarily for their wool, also needed winter care. Sheep are hardy animals, able to survive cold conditions, but they still needed food and shelter. They might be kept in a simple shed or barn, protected from the worst weather. Pigs, as mentioned earlier, were often slaughtered before winter to avoid having to feed them through the cold months. But any pigs kept alive through winter needed food. They could eat scraps and waste that humans wouldn't eat, but they still needed a substantial amount of food. Chickens, if a family had them, were valuable for their eggs, but chickens lay fewer eggs in winter when days are short. Still, even a few eggs were valuable, providing protein that might otherwise be scarce. Some families, especially in the coldest regions, brought their animals inside the house during winter. The animals' body heat helped warm the living space. The animals were kept at one end of the house, separated by a partition, but their presence was certainly felt. The smell, the sounds, the additional work of managing them. For the animals, being inside was better than being outside in freezing temperatures. For the humans, it was a trade off more warmth, but also more crowding, more smell, more mess. Caring for animals added to the daily workload, but it was necessary. These animals represented wealth, food security, and livelihood. Their survival through winter was almost as important as human survival. It's worth pausing here to discuss the Little Ice Age, which made medieval winters particularly severe, especially in the later medieval period. The Little Ice Age was a period of cooling that lasted roughly from 1300 to 1850, though the dates are debated. During this time, average temperatures in Europe dropped. Winters became longer and colder, and summers were shorter and cooler. This climatic change had profound effects on medieval society. Growing seasons shortened, meaning less time to cultivate crops and smaller harvests. Glaciers in the Alps advanced, destroying some mountain villages. Rivers and harbors that rarely froze in earlier centuries now froze regularly. The Thames River in London, which now rarely freezes, froze solid multiple times during the Little Ice Age. Frost fairs were held on the frozen river, with tents, food stalls, and entertainment set up on the ice. In the countryside, the effects were more serious. Crops failed more frequently. Harvests were smaller. The food that could be stored for winter was insufficient. Famine became more common. The Great Famine of 1315-17 was one consequence of the Little Ice Age, and usually cold and wet weather led to crop failures across northern Europe. Millions of people died of starvation and diseases related to malnutrition. For the peasants living through this time, the Little Ice Age meant that winter survival became even more precarious. The strategies their grandparents had used were no longer sufficient. The climate had changed, and they had to adapt. Adaptations included changing which crops were grown, adjusting agricultural practices, and perhaps most importantly, emigrating. Some people moved from areas that became too cold or wet to farm successfully to regions with better growing conditions. But for those who stayed, winter became a more severe test of endurance. The cold was deeper, lasted longer. Snow fell more heavily and stayed longer. Food shortages were more frequent and more severe. Yet people survived. They adapted, they endured, they found ways to continue. Human ingenuity and resilience are remarkable, and medieval people demonstrated these qualities in their response to climatic change. Late winter, from January into February, was often the hardest part of the year. By this point, food stores were running low. The novelty of winter had worn off. The celebrations of Christmas were past, and spring, while theoretically approaching, still seemed far away. This was when people were hungriest. The grain bins were less than half full. The preserved meats were nearly gone. Root vegetables in the cellar were sprouting or rotting. Every meal required careful calculation to ensure that the remaining food would last until new food became available. Hunger has physical effects. The body, deprived of adequate calories, begins to break down its own tissues. Muscles weaken. Fat reserves, if there were any, are used up. People become thin, gaunt. Their faces take on a hollow look. Their movements slow. Energy is conserved because there is no energy to spare. Hunger also has psychological effects. Thoughts become obsessed with food. Conversations turn to what was eaten in better times, what will be eaten when spring comes, what is stored in the cellar. Dreams feature feasts in abundance. Children cried from hunger. Adults endured silently, their faces drawn with worry and want. The elderly, already weakened by age, sometimes simply gave up, dying in the last weeks of winter before relief came. But there were strategies to cope even with this hardship. Meals could be stretched by adding more water to the pottage, making it thinner, but filling more bowls. Wild plants, even in winter, might provide some nutrition. Tree bark could be ground and added to bread dough, for instance. Though it had no nutritional value, it filled the stomach. People also relied on community support in these desperate times. Those with a little extra might share with neighbors who had nothing. The church might distribute what charity it could. Families helped each other, knowing that next year their positions might be reversed. Still, some did not survive late winter. The very young, the very old, the sick, these were the most vulnerable. Their deaths were grieved, but also in some sense, expected. Winter claimed its victims, and this was understood to be part of the natural order. Surviving late winter required both physical endurance and mental fortitude. The body had to keep functioning despite inadequate nutrition. The mind had to stay hopeful despite bleak circumstances. Both required strength. And then, finally, came the signs that winter was ending. These signs were subtle at first, easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention. But people were paying close attention. They were watching desperately for any indication that relief was coming. The first sign was usually in the light. The sun, which had been rising late and setting early, began to change its patterns. The sunrise came a minute earlier, then 2 minutes, then 5. The sunset came later. The days were lengthening, slowly but surely. This change in daylight had physical effects. With more sunlight, vitamin D production increased, helping people who had been deficient all winter. The additional light also had psychological effects, lifting moods that had been depressed by the long darkness. Birds began to return. First came the early migrants, birds that had only gone south for a short distance. Their songs, absent all winter, filled the air again. People heard these songs and smiled. The birds knew that spring was coming. On warmer days, snow began to melt. Water dripped from roofs, ran in small rivulets down streets and paths. Mud appeared, that distinctive spring mud that was both annoying and wonderful because it meant the earth was thawing. The wind changed character. Winter wind had been cold, biting, harsh. Spring wind was gentler, warmer, carrying different smells, earth instead of ice, growing things instead of bare branches. And then came the green, first just a hint, a few tiny shoots pushing up through the earth, then more and more. Grass began to grow. Buds appeared on trees and bushes. Slowly, hesitantly at first, but with growing confidence, color returned to the world. People ventured outside more. The desperate need to conserve heat indoors relaxed slightly. Children played outside, running and shouting with the freedom of movement. Adults stood in the sun, letting its warmth soak into their cold, numbed bodies. Food became available again, not much at first, but something. Wild greens could be gathered from fields and forests, nettles, dandelion leaves, other edible plants. These provided fresh vegetables after months without any. They tasted wonderful, not because they were objectively delicious, but because they were fresh and new and represented hope. In the fields, work could begin again. The frozen earth thawed enough to be worked. Plows could be brought out, seeds could be planted. The agricultural cycle could restart. This was Candlemas and beyond, February into March, the transition time between winter and spring. It was not yet warm. There would still be cold days, even cold weeks, but the trajectory was clear. Winter was ending, spring was coming. People had survived. As we come to the end of this long exploration of medieval winter survival, let us reflect on what these people endured and how they endured it. Medieval winters were harsh by any standard. The cold, the darkness, the hunger, the illness, these were serious challenges that tested human endurance. Without modern technology, without central heating or electric lights or grocery stores or medicine, people faced winter with only the resources they could gather and store themselves. And yet they survived. Generation after generation, through countless winters, medieval people endured and persisted. They developed strategies for preservation, storage, and survival. They built communities that supported each other through hard times. They maintained hope even when conditions were grim. Their lives were hard, harder than most of us can truly imagine. The monotony of winter days, the constant cold, the perpetual hunger in late winter, these would be nearly unbearable for people accustomed to modern comforts. But for medieval people, this was simply life. They knew no other way, and within the constraints of their existence, they found meaning, connection, and even moments of joy. A fire on a cold night, a full belly after a meal, the laughter of children, the warmth of community. These simple things took on great significance. Their resilience is remarkable. Their ability to cope with conditions that would break many modern people speaks to human adaptability and strength. They remind us that humans are capable of enduring extraordinary hardship when necessary. As we conclude this narration, let us remember these medieval people in their long winter nights. Let us remember their struggles, their strategies, their stubborn determination to survive. Let us remember that winter always ended, that spring always came, that hope persisted even in the darkest times. And now, as this narration comes to a close, may you find rest. May the details of medieval life, the slow rhythm of winter days, the gentle repetition of daily tasks bring you peace and relaxation. May you sleep deeply and well, knowing that even the longest winter eventually ends and spring always returns. Rest well.